Order. A call to order today's Defence Committee evidence session on the UK's contribution to European security, and I am very, very delighted that we have with us two eminently qualified individuals to give evidence, namely Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman, the Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London. Welcome back, Professor. You have given evidence on previous occasions, so delighted to have you back. We also have joining us virtually Dr. Alexandra Scheffer, who is the acting president of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. A very warm welcome, Dr. Scheffer.
Thank you.
Right, without further ado then, let's get straight into our questions for this hearing, and I invite my colleague Lincoln Job, please.
Professor, good morning, and thank you for coming this morning. You were required reading at various courses that I did throughout my military career, so it's a great pleasure to see you in person. If we could sort of set the context for our discussion and invite you to give us your assessment of where we're currently at in Ukraine with the conflict there, and invite you to sort of, in answering that sort of today question, maybe take a look back, and if I could invite you to take a slight look forward as well.
Thanks very much. Well, first, it's an honour to be here and delighted to be able to hopefully answer your questions. If we start with Ukraine, there's a puzzle with Ukraine, because if you look at much of the commentary, it takes for granted that the Russians have the initiative and that they're moving on. If you actually look at what's happened since the latest Russian offensive started, which I'd put late 2023, it's gained very little. The situation on the front is a bit different. They've taken a few cities, a few towns, but as a percentage of Ukrainian territory, it's quite small. And I think it's been quite frustrating, because I think for the Russians, it's been frustrating, because if you look back about a year ago, when the American aid had been suspended because Congress wouldn't pass a supplemental bill, there was a big expectation that the Ukrainians would be struggling, and that could be seen in Putin's remarks and so on. And I think that also reflects the position he took in June 2024, when the current Russian negotiating position was set out. But they've achieved very little since then. Secondly, we're coming to the end of the latest winter, and their attempts to knock Ukrainians out through attacks on their critical infrastructure, all of which have done damage. None of what I'm saying underestimates the pain and difficulty the Ukrainians have suffered, but again, the Ukrainians are coming through that period. So the best description of where we are at the moment is not much further along than we were a year ago, or even a year and a half ago. Now, there's obviously a couple of things going on. First, there is a question about whether the balance in armament is shifting, at least temporarily, a bit more in favour of Ukraine, or at least the Russian advantage is being decreased. And I think there's some evidence of that. Ukraine has made a few gains, not massively significant, but in eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk, where a lot of the fighting is going on at the moment. Obviously, it's been pushed out of Kursk, which was always likely, but again, quite painful and difficult, although not the sort of slaughter that Putin had talked about, and which Trump apparently picked up. So they're largely out of Kursk, which limits some of the Ukrainian bargaining options there, pushing a little bit in Belgorod, which is another Russian province. But there's nothing dramatic going on. There is what is happening, I think, is that the Russians are throwing everything they can at Ukrainian cities and towns. So there's a lot of, not even really pretending in many cases that they're after military-related targets. And they may be preparing for just a big offensive in any time now. That has to be assumed. But I would take it that they're really not in a position to achieve militarily the political objectives that Putin set out. They can't get all of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. They've got most of Luhansk, but the other provinces, they're falling short. And to take Zaporizhzhia and Kherson is probably beyond them militarily. They may go in other directions, but they've got to cross rivers and so on. So at least for the next 6 months or so, it's hard to see a lot of change, but there could be some more fighting. Over time, of course, if the Ukrainians are not getting the same sort of support from the United States, then it becomes more difficult, and one shouldn't underplay that. And again, I don't want to underplay just how tough this has been for the Ukrainians as well as for the Russians. It's been a very hard slog on both sides. And finally, just to talk a little bit on the diplomacy, I've been reasonably sceptical of this all the way through. President Trump has focused very strongly on an immediate ceasefire with which Ukraine, I think, could cope. They wouldn't want a frozen conflict because that would mean the Russians de facto had got 20% of Ukrainian territory, but they could use the respite. The Russians have always been adamantly against a ceasefire without a political settlement, and I think it's just worth just saying why, because this divergence between what Trump says the Russians are interested in and what the Russians say they're interested in is really quite sharp. The Russians' position is that they want these 4 provinces. They're now part of the Russian constitution. They formally annexed them. Secondly, they want a subjugated Ukraine, disarmed. Again, that's part of their formal position, neutralized, not part of NATO or the EU. Now they're stressing a different government, a change of regime in Ukraine. That has always been around there. Now, this is not what the Trump administration is talking about. And even if they were, they can't deliver it. The Ukrainians can keep on going. So, and the 2 areas where we thought we might get partial ceasefires, neither of them seem to be sticking. That's the attack on energy infrastructure and attacks on energy infrastructure and Black Sea shipping, because on the former, it's pretty. There's no written formal agreement. There's no agreement on targets. The Russians said it came into effect almost as soon as Putin had his phone call with Trump, with nothing particularly agreed, and then they started attacking energy infrastructure anyway. On the Black Sea, they set down conditions which essentially mean the removal of sanctions, and the Europeans won't agree to that, even if the Americans were tempted. So it's hard to. President Trump has now said he's cross and angry with the Russians, so maybe he'll do something about that. So my prognosis, I'm afraid, is that we carry on as before, at least for the coming months, and then we start to see whether or not there's a shift as a result of changes in American policy.
Thank you very much. I can see Dr. Alexandra desperate to get in, but I just want to ask one more sort of supplementary question, which is, have you made any form of assessment of the impact of the North Korean contribution to the Russian forces?
Well, first it was confined to Kursk. I don't think the Russians wanted to have the issue of the North Koreans fighting inside what is internationally believed to be Ukrainian territory. So they're helping Russia defend itself against the Ukrainians. It made a difference. I mean, at a high cost to the North Koreans, but you can't. And initially, I think the North Koreans struggled. Eventually, as armies do, they adapted. So it made a difference. It's part of a wider support for the war, which is also extends to ammunition and some kit, which has also been important. And the you see on the Russian side grumbles about quality and obviously language difficulties and so on. So in the end, the Russians pushed the Ukrainians out. So, and the North Koreans were part of that. So, whether they'll have any much impact now, I tend to doubt in terms of troops, except maybe in these little slithers of Kursk and Belgorod that the Ukrainians have.
Thank you. Dr. De Hoop Scheffer, is there anything you'd like to add?
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I had the pleasure of following Lawrence Freedman's lectures when I was a long time ago a student at the King's College in London. So it's always a pleasure to listen to you. I wanted to make very quick 3 points and wrap this into the new transatlantic environment in which we are all operating. One is, I think there needs to be a shift in Europe's strategic mindset. I've been working in this field, European defense, transatlantic relationship, for over 20 years, and it's always been the same debate, right? The same old boring debate about burden sharing and how can Europeans step up, and basically how can Europeans do not without the United States, but with less America. And I think that's really the shift in the mindset that you're seeing these past couple of weeks with the European summits taking place between Paris and London. And I'll get back then, to the role of the UK and the French-UK co-leadership. But that's number one, because if you've mentioned the Trump administration, what you're seeing today in Washington is what I see as an acceleration. The trends that we're seeing are not new. They actually go back way and way back in history. I would say basically on day one that NATO was created back in 1949, but the trends are accelerating. And so I think we are now beyond the burden sharing debate, and we are now in the burden shifting debate. The message coming from Washington is very clear to Europeans, is you need to take care of your own security and defense, and therefore you need to step up. And what you've seen these past couple of weeks is an acceleration within the European debate. And I purposely say European and not EU, because obviously the UK plays a critical role. So that's number one. What does it entail? It entails a huge shift in terms of how Europeans think about their own strategic interests and their own deterrence and security. Why? Because Europeans must learn to think of their own defense and security not as a function of US strategy in Europe, but as a function of European strategic interests. And to a big extent, and that's the most delicate thing to do, is to unlearn the old reflexes in thinking about European security. When you look at NATO from a command structure, from a cultural structure, has been built and is still built today around the idea that the United States is here and will always be there. Now, things are shifting. And so it's less about building a so-called European pillar. I would say it's more ambitious than that. We need to be more ambitious. It's about thinking of responsibility sharing. And that's a much more interesting debate than the American European pillar, burden shifting or burden sharing. It's about Europeans and Americans getting together having a strategic conversation about rebalancing the conversation on European security and defense and rebalancing the how we do it. And that's more interesting. And the second point I wanted to make is when you look at the dynamics within Europe today, what I think is really interesting, and I applaud that, is seeing Paris and London co-authoring the leadership of these conversations. And I think that's exactly right. I also see a lot of Weimar plus conversations, including, of course, Poland, including Germany, including sometimes Italy. And it strikes me reading last March 12th joint declaration of ministers of defense of these 5 countries I've just mentioned. The conclusion was, I think, exactly the right framework within which we should be holding this conversation. It was about maintaining a strong transatlantic link while significantly increasing the EU capabilities for its own deterrence and defense. And that's the notion of rebalancing I was mentioning. The last point I wanted to make, I think, is really important, because what I'm seeing is our political leaders, our society, still being caught in the so-called guns or butter debate, fueled, of course, by the rise of the far right across all EU member countries. I think it really is a responsibility of political leaders today to better explain to their citizens why it is important to preserve the security of the European continent, to make sure that this deal that will hopefully make Ukraine and the eastern flank a more stable region for Europe, why it is important to spend in defense. And that's why what I regret is that continuously we put the money before the why. I would like to see that conversation being reversed. So let's talk about the why, the strategy, the vision, and then let's discuss budget and, the percentage of GDP in terms of defense spending. What you read in the press and what you hear in these conversations, NATO, EU, are too much focused on the numbers and the percentage, and it's less focused on the why. And then you have these divergences of views between political leaders that are difficult to actually overcome. So that to me would be very helpful. And I think to convince citizens why it's important, having strategy first and then explaining why it's important to invest, and that, by the way, there will be a return on investment for their own European industrial base, that it's also about investing in technological innovation, in energy transition. I think this is a way of, showing that hard power is not just about military, but it's also about our democratic resilience. I'll end up by saying that what's tricky today for Europe is that there is a timing issue. There is the short term, the immediate term, and the longer term. In the short term, it's very difficult not to rely on the United States and not to rely on the US defense industry. But then there's the middle to longer term that Europeans need to work on and prepare now, so that in 5 years from now, they are able actually to defend their own security and defense with less America. I'll end up here.
Thank you very much indeed. 2 amazing opening remarks. And with the frantic rewriting of questions all around me, I'm very glad I went first.
Yeah. Thank you very much. All right, my request to the panel is there's quite a lot of ground to cover and amongst committee members. So what I would request yourself is please do keep the remarks as succinct as possible in order that we can then get more questions in. But with that, Ian Room, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to both panellists for giving evidence today. And Professor, I know that you have noted that Ukrainians stress that they will continue to fight under all circumstances. And in your view, could Ukraine continue to fight without US support?
Yes, but with difficulty. So at the moment, about 55% of what Ukrainians fight with is they produce themselves. And this is an important shift. They've obviously got two separate conversations, one about the state of Ukraine, the other sort of the wider European role. But if the Europeans want to work hard on Ukraine in the short term, about which it seems to me is absolutely critical in terms of the long term for European security as well, then supporting Ukrainian defence industries is a pretty good way to start. About 25% of what Ukraine fights with comes from Europe, including the UK, and others, and about 20% from the US. The US provides the higher end stuff, which HIMARS and things like that, so without that, you have increasing problems. So I don't personally think you'll just have a sort of, at the moment anyway, an abrupt break, but we had something that looked like it a few weeks ago when President Trump was cross with President Zelensky. And you'll note one of the major things that caused the Ukrainians problem then was intelligence support. And so that I think what we now know is some of the things where there is a dependence on the US, and if we're going to move to a situation where the Europeans are doing more, then that's one of the things we need to look at quite carefully, and I think it is one of the things that's currently being discussed. So that, I think, just following on from what Dr. Scheffer was saying, there's some short-term problems that are difficult, but we've got notice now of what they are, and if we can keep the Americans engaged for as long as possible, then we've got time to manage the transition a bit better.
And could you elaborate on how likely it is the prospect that the Ukrainians will have to go it alone without the US?
It's very difficult to say. I mean, I would take it as a starting point for almost all our discussions that the American footprint in Europe will shrink. Whatever happens, I think that's just where they are, what they're planning for. How far they shrink is still up for debate, because I think there'll be resistance in the Senate if they shrink too much. And Dr. Scheffer mentioned the commands. I really don't think the Senate would like to see the Americans give up major commands in Europe, but that requires a certain level of commitment, so we don't know. At the moment, the negotiations are sort of a blame game, with both sides trying to demonstrate that the other is responsible for their failure. At the moment, I would say the Russians are responsible for their failure because they can't give the President Trump what he wants, in which case maybe he'll put some more pressure on them. I think President Zelensky is doing his best to stay close to the Trump administration. The fly in the ointment there is the minerals deal, which is very unequal, sort of vaguely extortionate, but like a lot of things that this administration proposes, the link with reality is and what actually will happen if it's ever enacted is unclear. But that I think is probably the major difficulty that the the Ukrainians face at the moment. So I'm not sure that they're going to be just cut off completely. There is a risk of that. It is, however, unlikely that you're going to get another big supplemental bill like we had last April, and on which the Ukrainians are still benefiting. So again, you have to assume declining American support. As with a lot of these discussions, it's a question of whether it's a sort of steady, manageable decline or cliff edge.
Thank you. Dr. Alexandra, would you like to come in on that question?
Yes, no, just totally agree with Lawrence Freedman. I think there is no scenario where the United States will decide to fully withdraw its support from Ukraine or from European security and defense, mainly because it's a source of revenue for the United States when you think of the amount of military equipment that they have sold to Europe since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. That's number one. There is no scenario of U.S. withdrawing its support from Ukraine also because the stakes are so high for the U.S. credibility in the world. And around President Trump, there are a few advisors that are fully supportive of this idea that if a bad deal is signed on Ukraine, this will have global ramification when it comes to U.S. credibility. And very last thing, yes, Europeans will be able to step up. But as Lawrence Freedman was just saying, there are critical capabilities that the U.S. have and that Europe will continue to need. And so again, I believe that there should be a transatlantic conversation where we agree on a responsibility sharing and not a division of labor where the U.S. negotiates and then the Europeans implements the ceasefire or preserves it. Instead of being in a division of labor scenario, which is a scenario we are in, we should be discussing together how do we make this happen and how do we end this war in the most constructive, positive, sustainable way for the future of European security and defense.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Mike Martin, please.
Just, actually, Dr. Alexandra, if I could just pick up on something you said there about American credibility, and you don't think that there'll be a total drawdown of American support to Ukraine because of that American credibility. But that's exactly what we saw when Trump negotiated a deal in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was not a deal, that was a capitulation. It was an abandonment of an ally of 20 years. It was done without the European... You know, the parallels, there are sort of quite stark parallels between what happened in Afghanistan and in Ukraine, and actually you can make the argument that the chaotic American withdrawal from Ukraine contributed to Putin's thinking in 2022 when he was thinking about whether to invade Ukraine. So yeah, I just wonder if you could just explore that tension there.
Yes, I think there is an understanding today that, and that's a motto you're hearing a lot in the Washington bubble political circles, that Ukraine should not become the current administration's Afghanistan. So the parallel is obvious. You're absolutely right. But there is a sort of awareness that Ukraine should not be Trump's Afghanistan. So that's number one. Number two, and that's what Lawrence Freedman was saying a couple of minutes ago, I think there is a scenario that Europeans are not anticipating enough, but that you might see unraveling in the days or weeks to come, is an American administration losing patience with Putin's strategy of trying to gain time and deciding to escalate, not only on sanctions, but potentially escalating on the military assistance to Ukraine. And within that escalation scenario to then de-escalate, Europeans will be required to follow and to support that escalation. So it's been quite a while. I've been thinking about this scenario. It's not a de-escalation or a withdrawal, but at the contrary, a decision made by the US administration to go full speed because Putin is not being cooperative. And there you would have to have a conversation among Europeans and Americans on how to manage this escalation together.
And that's really interesting and quite heartening, although escalate to de-escalate is a kind of a reflection of Russian doctrine, isn't it? So taking that all into account, I mean, there's various pathways here, Dr. Alexandra. What would you say, is there a chance of a ceasefire then a peace deal, or a peace deal then a ceasefire? I mean, do you think with the current players in the ring and the current positions of those players, that's a likely scenario in, say, the next 18 months?
I think what's really important today is, and that's what actually the UK and France have been actively doing these past couple of weeks in tandem, is in order to avoid a deal that is being discussed bilaterally between the US administration and Putin, and then having the plan delivered and putting Europeans in front of a fait accompli, I think that would be the worst scenario. Mm-hmm. And so it is up to Europeans to be very active in the conversation and to make sure that what is being discussed will not undermine Ukraine and will not undermine the future of European security and defense. And how do Europeans do that? And that's where I think Europeans need to accelerate, is by showing to Washington that they are able to deliver. They are able to deliver from an operational perspective, from a money investment perspective, and that they are taking that seriously. And that will send a message to the United States that we are serious. We understand this is serious, but we also want to be part of the conversation. What I'm seeing today is Ukraine and the Ukraine, negotiations reflecting a broader trend in geopolitics. Having the Russian-US or the Ukraine-US conversations taking place in Saudi Arabia is an indicator of how things are shifting. You will probably have China part of the conversations, Turkey, Gulf states, Qatar, who has been very active as a mediating power as well. And so in this shifting alliances that has accelerated with the war in Ukraine and accelerated with the way the American administration is handling the negotiations, it's going to be very challenging, but absolutely critical for Europeans to find a place at the table, because this is the only way to ensure that European security and defense will be preserved in a sustainable way. And that's why I think the Sturmer engagement strategy, nonstop with the American administration, is exactly what should be done. And by trying to rally as much as European partners into the conversation. But let's stop discussing and let's start delivering concrete actions, concrete numbers, and present them to the American administration. So it's also a question of European credibility, if I can say.
Thank you, Doctor. And then just quickly to you, Professor Laurie. I mean, it seems that the demands of Russia and the demands of Ukraine and Europe are mutually exclusive and haven't really changed much. So just quickly, what would you say is the likelihood of a ceasefire then peace, or peace then ceasefire?
Putin wants a peace and then a ceasefire. Ukraine wants a ceasefire and then a peace, as I think does Trump. I don't think Putin is ready to do a deal at the moment, but he's under pressure. And I suspect we've got months ahead. And if the Russians keep on failing to make a lot of progress in their main objectives, and with their economy in some difficulty because of, they've got 21% interest rates, 10-11% inflation, and these aren't going down at the moment, having had sort of boom years because of a war economy, it's now turning, and their economy will have lower growth. We've all got these issues, but oil prices, again, something to watch. You could get to a situation where the Russians also feel they need a ceasefire. I don't think they feel that at the moment. I think the Ukrainians probably do, by the end of the year, need a ceasefire at some point. So I think you've got all these pressures coming up. I think we've moved beyond the point where we feared a few weeks ago that this would just be a deal done by the US and Russians. I think it's pretty apparent now that the US can't deliver what the Russians want and doesn't particularly want to deliver what the Russians want. So we've got a much more complex diplomacy. I think, we have to remember that the Europeans were leading on Ukraine diplomacy all the way from 2014 to 2022. If there was going to be a diplomatic deal, we were looking to France and Germany to do it. I think Putin always wanted to do a deal with the Americans rather than them, but that's what we were looking at. So there's nothing particularly unique about the idea that Europeans will come into the process. And I think, if we're going to think about where this is all leading, it isn't just a question of boosting our defence role. Could well be a question of boosting the diplomatic role. And I don't think we've quite got our heads around what that would mean, because at the moment I think we find it difficult to imagine being the ones who are talking to Putin.
And would you say that the interventions of Donald Trump over the last few months, have they shifted the dial at all on the prospects for peace in Ukraine?
Well, yes. Because there wasn't a process at all. I think Scholz had one conversation with Putin last year, and that was about it. And then you had a variety of emissaries going. The Saudis tried that, 2023 probably. There hasn't been very much going. So now you have a process which we didn't have before, and that's clarifying the interests, and it's opening up possibilities. I think the Ukrainian view was that you needed sort of small things, maybe prisoner exchanges, which we have had, as a way of building confidence, and you could build up from that. Trump, I think always on these occasions, if you're setting yourself up as in charge of the process, you've got to work out whether you're a mediator, somehow trying to find some common ground between the two parties, which is very difficult in this case because it's pretty incompatible, or you come in with your own plan, which I think is what Trump wants to do. And if that's happening, then you get to the scenario that Dr. Scheffer raised of if the Russians aren't playing ball, are you prepared to play? Are you going to raise the stakes? And I think that is the point we are at the moment. I'm less sure they will. And I think it's partly just to conclude, a problem with the administration is the administration's divided. There's a chunk of advisors to Trump who are pretty hostile to Ukraine, and would like to have good relations with Russia. I think the two key players, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, are much more sceptical of Russia, more ready to support Ukraine. And you can see that sort of being played out in administration deliberations.
Very much.
Thank you very much. Just want to bring in here Emma Buck, please.
Thanks, Chair. Morning, both. Professor, I wonder if you could first share your thoughts with us on how realistic a European peacekeeping force with a US backstop is, and what on earth would that look like? Because I'm not clear.
Well, first, it's probably unwise to call it a peacekeeping force. Peacekeeping has a very particular connotation, sort of UN blue hats, lightly armed, interposing themselves between the two parties, basically to see if there's compliance. Now, we had that in 2022, not from the UN, but from the OSCE, and didn't do any good at all. You could imagine circumstances in which there is a peacekeeping force, but it wouldn't be from Europe. And the Russians have spoken a bit about that possibility. So what the Europeans have been talking about with the Ukrainians, and I think this started from a point where there was a real worry that there would be a Russian-US deal that would sort of be pushed onto Ukraine without any security guarantees at all. Is what do you do instead of that? So that's was the starting point. The difficulty is that you've got to give the Ukrainians confidence that the same thing won't happen again, that they're not just going to be pushed back to the state they were in 2022, except sort of battered and bruised as a result of the last 3 years. So how do you, and if you can't have NATO, and even if the US was supportive of the NATO idea, which it isn't, we know that Hungary and others could form obstacles. So if you can't have that, what do you do instead? So the idea that was developed was of a deterrent force, I think is the best way to think of it, which would go behind your Ukrainian lines and mean that so you would both bolster the Ukrainians, and then if the Russians were making progress, they would have to contemplate fighting European countries, which is would be a big step for us to take. This is not a trivial commitment to be making. I think two things have happened since this idea began to be tabled. Well, three things have happened. First, there's been a lot more work being done, and we've had mention of the conversations in Paris and London on this. Lots of countries are saying we're prepared to support and so on, but what does that support actually mean? What can they contribute? Secondly, I think we're clearly not going to have a deal very quickly, not of the sort that would produce this question as sort of first order. And therefore, we've got a bit more time to talk about it. The negotiations themselves are more about how do you actually get through the first stages than how do you mark the last stage, which is what this would be. And I think also that just the thinking in all of this has moved slightly away from a land force and more on a focus on air and maritime. Now that also brings risk, but it's less of a it seems less than actually putting our forces behind Ukrainian lines. And one of the problems is to make a difference, you need a lot of forces. Just to conclude on this point, if you want, let's say you wanted a force of, 20,000 troops, you need about 60,000 to have it present. You need about 20,000 training, 20,000 there, 20,000 recovering as you rotate the forces. So I think that's going to be quite a thing to put together. The air and the maritime, less difficult, and probably in some ways more useful. I think even if you had a ground force there, you'd want an air component as well. And so you see more conversations moving to that rather than just simply a land force.
So in terms of, thank you for that, so in terms of this deterrence force that you've referred to, do you think that Europe without the US has the kit and has the personnel to provide that? That's what I struggle with, the numbers and the actual cold hard reality is, do we have that?
With all of these conversations, you look at Europe and you think, why not? I mean, you know, the numbers are there, you could find the troops. There's the so-called sort of Libyan precedent going back to 2011 when UK and France decided that they were going to help the rebels who looked like they were about to be slaughtered by Gaddafi's troops, and sort of announced this sort of air campaign, and they couldn't do it without the Americans. And at the moment you would need at least American support to get it in place, to help sustain it. Over time you ought to be able to manage it without a large American role. But I think one of the reasons there's a bit of anxiety at the moment is that you know, we're just not with all the logistical support, intelligence support, we'd struggle. So this is just a microcosm of the larger problem, that in order to be able to play the sort of more autonomous role Europeans might like to play, they need more time and they need to work on it. I think you would hope that if Trump had this sort of deal, and the key thing was making sure that the Ukrainians had some reassurance, then he would see the advantages of supporting the Europeans in providing it. So, you know, I think it would be the most dire scenario where some deal was imposed and then the Americans completely walked away.
Thank you. Doctor, I think you've been waiting to come in.
Yes, no, very quick, completely agree. You know, I think a US enabling role would be absolutely indispensable. And that's, by the way, you know, what the French president and the British prime minister have been, you know, trying to convey to President Trump. As Lawrence Freedman, there are critical areas where Europeans are still hyper dependent on the United States. That's, you know, intel, satellites, it's transportation of troops, air-to-air refueling. But again, I do believe that these, you know, capability gaps should be filled very quickly. I mean, in 3 years from now, I truly do not understand why Europeans would not be able to fill some of these critical gaps. And absolutely, Europeans need now to invest in the credibility of their future military power. But again, that's the timing, the tempo issue of it. Underlying, there is the very short term where Europeans are still hyper dependent and will need this US enabling role, and that should be part of a negotiation between Washington and European capitals, while Europeans invest now to build up and fill some of these capability gaps for the 3 to 5 years to come.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Right, we've just got over an hour and there's still quite a lot of ground to cover, so my request again to the panel would be to keep the responses as succinct as can possibly be. And we now want to move the shift of the focus of the conversation from Ukraine onto European security. So, and in particular, the current US administration's approach to that. I'd like to bring in Fred Thomas, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, both of you. If I could come to Dr. de Hoop Scheffer first. We've spoken a lot about the shifting landscape. You've described it as a kind of need to move away from habit of how we think about NATO security in Europe, away from immediately thinking about what the American strategy is, to thinking more now about what actually is our as European strategy. Can we do that in the context of nuclear and nuclear weapons? And we've seen since the new American administration, many European countries expressing an interest in some kind of collective nuclear deterrence that does not rely on US guarantees. Obviously, the UK and France have got nuclear capabilities. What can we do together to provide some kind of reassurance to European partners that they would benefit from a collective European nuclear deterrence. Imagining for a second, I don't think we'll get there, obviously, I hope we don't, and I don't think we would get there, but imagining that there was no American support. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. No, that's a critical question. It's a debate that has been taking much more scope and place in the strategic conversations taking place within Europe. I've been part of these conversations as well. De facto, the French nuclear deterrent is a deterrent for the whole of Europe. De facto, the UK as well, and I think it's not, random that France and the UK today are leading the overall deterrence security guarantee conversations, because these are the two European nuclear powers. So that's number one. As you know, nuclear deterrence is a national responsibility. But this should not be an obstacle to have a European conversation. And by the way, what I'm seeing from Nordic, Baltic, Central, Eastern European countries, but also Southern European countries, they're all looking in particular at France as an EU member state, NATO member state, and asking France to be more explicit on the coverage, if I can say, of the French nuclear deterrence. So I would say let's not be attached to any taboo. We should have these conversations together, but we also need to be very realistic that the US nuclear umbrella, right, and the fact that we use the term umbrella is very telling, cannot be replaced by either the Brit or the French nuclear deterrence. It's not the same dimension, but we should be having this conversation among Europeans. And by the way, this conversation has already started.
Thank you so much. And Professor Freedman, forgive me, to talk about, that was very much an answer quite appropriately based on nuclear deterrence at a strategic level. To talk, as we have to, about tactical nuclear weapons, and we've seen Polish making noises in that direction. They'd like to have that capability. And I think that we've seen fairly recently Prime Minister Tusk saying that they needed to have, quote, the most modern capabilities also related to nuclear weapons and modern unconventional weapons. And we know that France have got a small arsenal of air-launched, non-strategic nuclear weapons. We in the UK do not. We've got only strategic weapons with our Trident missiles in the submarines. What is your assessment in the light of the shifting landscapes in the last few weeks of the European, not necessarily British, but European necessity to have that kind of capability?
It's a tricky one. And I mean, the starting point is that the Russians have put a lot of emphasis on short-range systems. They have lots of them. And even in the American debate, there's a question of whether they need more as a way of countering that particular Russian capability. Now, there's a problem because we talk about tactical nuclear weapons as if this is almost just another munition, but use of any nuclear weapon would be a pretty strategic act. And we've seen this in the debate, going back to Ukraine, about whether the Russians would use these sorts of weapons in the Ukrainian context. And they don't. They haven't. And I think because it's strategic, in the end, it would be a pretty big deal. And you'd therefore have to ask, what is the advantage of using a short-range system to change what's going on the battlefield? Possibly. Would it make a massive difference? You'd have to use quite a lot of them to do so, and then you've irradiated a large part of the territory you're supposedly trying to capture. You've got issues of fallout and so on. It's not a simple calculation from a Russian side. Do we therefore... my view of this is that it's actually quite a difficult capability for us to match, certainly not in the same numbers. They're using these weapons on the assumption you would not be escalating to longer range and larger systems is possibly unrealistic. You'd have to assume that anyway, and that therefore, and there are other things you can do to retaliate, as we discussed with Ukraine. I mean, most of the planning for the use of a Russian tactical nuke in the context of Ukraine did not envisage a nuclear response by the Allies. There's lots of ways of hurting countries without actually having to use nuclear weapons yourself. So I wouldn't personally put the same stress on this. I think it would be a very difficult capability to develop. There is the question of dual capable systems, where the Americans have a number of European countries would get access to American weapons in the event of a crisis. And there's one issue about whether the UK could also do this with its F-35s. You'd have to get different F-35s, given the Americans also have a base at Lakenheath. You could fit in with that. So there are ways in which you could increase it, but personally, I wouldn't make it my strongest priority because it's just a very difficult standard to meet.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Can I ask you now about EU spending? And we've seen a lot of news recently about the SAFE initiative, 150 billion euro defence financing piece. We know that Britain wants to be involved, but to do so will be required to sign the Security and Defence Partnership with the EU. And we've also seen that there has been some challenges to signing that, and there are some other issues not related to defence that require to be negotiated, related more to fishing, etc. Do you think, can I come to Dr. Scheffer first, do you expect that the UK and the EU will sign in May at the summit, the EU summit?
I hope so. No, I think it's about time, actually, that such an agreement is signed between the UK and the EU. I think that the remaining obstacles are totally, we can totally overcome some of these remaining obstacles that you just mentioned. But I think in the era in which we are living, with Ukraine, with many other challenges within and in the periphery of Europe from a security defense perspective, it is absolutely critical that the UK and the EU sign such an agreement. Absolutely.
I believe Jesse Norman wanted to come in on this point as well.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. It's really a question for Professor Freedman. Obviously, the statements coming out of the White House have been profoundly disturbing in relation to the nuclear deterrent and Five Eyes and other capabilities. But it's also evident that they are also highly disturbing to American security agencies and departments. Could you give us your read on what that domestic impact is within, so far as you've been able to pick it up, Department of Defense, State, NSA, CIA, other agencies?
Well, as with every bit of the federal government, there's a bit of turmoil at the moment. And I mean, let's say, first, the consensus view is that Europe needs to do more, should be doing more, and we need to work with them to do more. So the point about the declining American footprint and so on is pretty universal. I don't think there's controversy about that. The issue is how far you should go. So you've got the Vance view, which is clearly expressed in the signal leak, that Europeans should just basically be left to get on with it. and the Secretary of Defence appeared to be sympathetic to that. But in practice, I think the services would be horrified at the idea of a complete withdrawal from Europe, and that might be true of many Republicans in the Senate as well. So I think at the moment you were waiting to see what the Pentagon's plans are. He's asked, the Secretary of Defence has asked for substantial changes in the European commitment. That will happen. I think when they look at it, they'll find that some of the things they've been thinking about are very expensive. Actually, there's one idea floated to move from sort of Ramstein to Hungary. I don't think that will survive much scrutiny. But the fact that these debates are going on is a different situation. And sometimes you need to go through these debates to end up where you started. That may not be a bad thing. The problem, I think the difficulty with the US nuclear guarantee, which is what a lot of this comes down to, is, I can give you statements from late 1950s that give you every reason to doubt that if push came to shove, the Americans would do anything at all, because it's a big deal. And one of the reasons why the French have the nuclear doctrine they do is de Gaulle came to the conclusion that nuclear alliances were not really tenable, that the US would not sacrifice Chicago for Paris. So that has always been there. There's nothing new in that. But we've learned to live with it. We've decided that we're, in the end, even if it's difficult to believe, the alternatives to not believing are too expensive and difficult.
Yes.
And I think we're still in that position, except it's becoming harder to believe.
And obviously the European response is in the early stages of becoming a lot more serious.
Yeah.
What are the three things that would suggest to you that it was actually serious?
Well, I think the conversations that are going on, so it was notable that the next German Chancellor, almost as he was elected, raised this issue. Merz raised this issue. Tusk's been mentioned. It's on the minds of a lot of countries, and so there's talking about it. The French are clearly trying to work out some language which indicates that they do see the force de frappe as having some value for all of Europe, but it's controversial still in France. Le Pen, who's obviously got other things to worry about now, is not supportive of a general French guarantee. The UK has always committed its forces to NATO, but we've never really had a strong national debate about what that means. And I think that we've always had this idea, which is actually a French idea initially, of a second centre of decision making. So, if the Russians mistakenly discounted the Americans, they have to take account of the Brits and the French as well. But we haven't really thought about the idea of being the first centre of decision making. So we are at early stages, and I think these debates are going to be awkward because we, in the UK and France, traditionally we have thought of these as national deterrents, that what you have that gives you extra insurance if the Americans aren't there. We haven't really discussed them as openly as we should have done in terms of extended deterrence to our European partners.
Could I put the question to, if I could put the question to Dr. de Scheffer? Again, are there, 1, 2, 3 things that you would consider signs of real seriousness? You might think that they were financial. You might think that they were commitments of strategic posture. You might think that they were public debates being initiated and had, and, as it were, commitments being made domestically, internationally. What are the kinds of things that look like seriousness for you?
So first, the shift, the U-turn in the German debate that Lawrence Freedman just mentioned. I mean, that's, an earthquake for the German strategic political culture. That's number one. The second one is truly the shift in the strategic conversations in France. It's not new, but it has accelerated over these past couple of months. There has been a lot of engagement from the French government with a lot of our European partners on how France's nuclear forces can complement broader defense strategies. So I think there has been an acceleration in the strategic dialogues. So that might not seem like a watershed change, but it is.
Can I just push back
it is,
a second?
Because it's really,
like Germany
goes back to the shift in the strategic culture of these countries.
But can I just push back? It looks like Germany is preparing to consider, once again, Nord Stream 2. I mean, it's a strategic move that's extraordinarily damaging to Central Europe and Ukraine in particular. How can that possibly be on the agenda of the Chancellor if he's taking the kinds of serious-minded approach to Russia that you're suggesting he is?
I totally agree with you. For me, it's not compatible. It's absolutely not compatible. Because we all know today that if Putin is able to sustain his war effort in Ukraine, it's first and foremost because Europeans are still massively buying Russian energies, be it directly or indirectly, as we all know. And by the way, Trump's threat of sanctioning the oil industry of Russia is exactly the right approach, because if that doesn't stop, Russia's war effort will continue. So I completely agree with your statement, which is to say that this would be completely contradictory to the other positions that the future German Chancellor has been taking.
That's helpful. Thank you very much.
On Ukraine.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Calvin Bailey.
Thank you, Professor Lawrence. You spoke about intermediate nuclear forces and were quite dismissive of them in the discussion about how Europe should reprioritise its defence posture. And I just wanted to push back and sort of expand the discussion, because your inference was that the strategic culture that both the UK and France have developed post-Suez drove us down two entirely different roads. So forced to frat, about a layering approach and being able to intersect or prevent the escalation of conflict through a recognisable escalation. And that's why the INF process brought to a close the Cold War. I would challenge that actually intermediate nuclear forces are the most important nuclear forces, because they're the first ones on the ladder. So the UK entered into the Polaris Agreement, which is something that we still hold today. We'd like to think of it as Trident, but the Polaris Agreement basically committed the UK's response in the 1967 Healy defence paper to committing our intercontinental forces to NATO, and as a result they've never really been ours, and that was what you were alluding to in that discussion. We would like to believe that they are, but we have committed them to NATO. They are part of our NATO force offering, and it's inseparable within one exception, which is that exceptional national circumstances, which it says, which is the one case in which we can use it. So moving forward on that basis, should the UK seek to align its strategic culture with France in a more European approach, or are we comfortable with the two cultures that exist at the moment?
I mean, just to think first, the quote-unquote tactical, which is not a term I like, are not INF. Our intermediate nuclear forces are long-range systems still.
There's subs.
Yeah, I don't like. I mean, all of this language.
Continental.
Yeah.
You have a separable signature that prevents you from striking from escalation.
Yeah, I'm I'm a bit sceptical about these distinctions. We have a quote-unquote sub-strategic capability with Trident. I mean, essentially you can target it against a military formation. It's just a very expensive and rather brutal way of doing it. So I think the problem with the very short-range systems, where the Russians have got an abundance, is it would just take us an awful lot of time and effort and energy at a time when our nuclear capacity is stretched anyway to build that up. So I think that's slightly separate. You're correct, obviously, on the separate ways the French and the British went after Suez. We went for interdependence. The French went for independence. Trident can still be used independently. It's not. We don't have to get the American permission to use it, and they couldn't stop us using it. Over time, if the Americans didn't want us to have a nuclear deterrent, they could make it difficult. We did get a lot of expense to get over that. I don't think we're there yet. And as you mentioned the clause that Macmillan put into the Polaris sales agreement on extreme national interest. Well, try to think of a time when nuclear weapons were about to be used, which wouldn't be a moment of extreme national interest. So, it's a big deal. So the doctrines are different, but not that far apart in practice. There's been, really for some time now, a lot of conversations between the British and French about how you maximize the joint capability. We have difficulties because of the, not the Polaris Agreement, but because of the 1958 agreement with the United States on...
It's effectively the Polaris Agreement.
Well, it was about sharing secrets. Yes. And because we got a lot of secrets from the Americans, you can't share them with the French. And that's inhibited quite a lot of cooperation in the past. But on things like, synchronizing patrols, so you've got the maximum number of boats out at any time, discussing common problems, all of these things can be done. And I don't think you have to go much beyond that to look at the two forces together and not just say, gosh, these are a lot smaller than the American force. They still pack a substantial punch. I think John Healey made that point the other day. There's a tendency to forget just what a single Trident warhead can do. So together they have quite a significant force. I think we're moving into a situation where we're just having to have more open conversations, not only with each other, but with our European colleagues about this.
So in that regard, and maybe on to Dr. Alexandra, what would you expect to see in the Strategic Defence Review, and would you see us having that discussion about the strategic culture? And it's quite important for us to note that there is a very discernible difference in strategic culture between us and the French, and the things that we have just been discussing.
I mean, I would hope that, I don't know, that the Strategic Defence Review will talk more openly about the capacity. I think, and I think John Healey was alluding to this the other day, we've tended to talk about our national nuclear force as sort of an awkward necessity and played it down, whereas the French have always played their force up. We've talked about a minimum deterrent and so on. I think in these circumstances, you've got to be prepared to draw more attention to it. So in that sense, I can see us, again, being closer to a French position. There is a difference.
It is a material change of culture, I think, as well. Dr. Alexandra, do you want to?
Mm-hmm. No, I think what's important is that as the UK and other European countries drafting their own sort of national security strategy or white paper, you name it. One thing that I would find interesting, and I know there has been in the past and invitations to have French, Germans, and others involved in some of these white papers work. The French has done it, the Germans have done it. And I would like to see much more of this collaboration as these reviews are being written. And that, to your question, on the strategic culture, actually, would be very, very helpful, a very helpful exercise. I think this sort of community approach should be enlarged to the think tank world as well, to have the most perspectives from the outside specialists and experts. So I think there's a sort of refresh to be done in terms of how these reviews are being conducted. I was actually engaged on some of these processes, but I think just by doing that exercise together with the French, with the Germans, is a very helpful exercise. Number two, yes, the UK-French strategic cultures are different, but I would tend to agree with what Lawrence Freedman said. There's a lot of convergence as well in terms of the mindset, in terms of how our military forces have been operating on the ground. And then again, it's not, a surprise to see the French and the British leading these conversations today on the so-called security guarantees with European partners. I also do see, and with this, what I would call a strategic complementarity between the French and the UK, between the French and the British strategic cultures, because we're not twins, but we do have some points in common. It is extremely interesting to see how the French and British tandem is working. And I would say an asset of having the French and British strengthening their cooperation is also allowing to rally different groups of European partners to the conversation. So that's the way I would, just frame these differences, but I see much more convergences than differences to bridge.
Thank you. I think it's important for us to remember that the genesis of the discussion and the point of the diversion was a direct threat on London and Paris, the absence of a US response. So when people talk about us being in exceptional times, we are not. We are not even approaching the worst of the threats that we have faced as a nation since the formation of NATO or the establishment or the writing of any of these agreements, which I think is what Professor Lawrence was pointing to earlier. And that's why I think there is a discussion about whether we continue on those trajectories or we draw into a convergence. And I hope that we come to a European one. With that, I cede.
Right, thank you very much. Alex Baker, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Professor Laurie and Dr. Alexandra, for your sharing your expertise with us. So there have been reports allies are hesitant to maintain their current resilience, their current reliance on the US defence industry. Rumours such as the fact there might be a F-35 kill switch is leading to much soul searching and a rapid reassessment of reliance on the US defence sector. Will this result in a boost for sovereign defence industries in the UK?
Yes, I hope so. It should do. Of course, American defence contractors are obviously aware of this issue. And the damage that was done with the cut-off of support, albeit brief, to Ukraine. So they know that if you get a reputation for providing kit which then can't be used, that's not going to be good for future orders. So that's a debate that's still going on. There's trade-offs which have dogged this issue for decades between getting off-the-shelf stuff from the Americans, which is affordable, and developing your own, which has often been produces excellent kit in very small quantities. So this is something that we need to sort out. And that's a general problem of European defence procurement, but one we're aware of has been problematic in the UK, and I know the government's got all sorts of initiatives to try to improve that, but a lot needs to be done. If we're going to get serious boosts to defence spending, then there are going to be areas where you're going to have to work more. I think one of the things to watch for, we always focus on the big high-ticket items, the big warships, the new aircraft and so on. A lot of what we really need at the moment is quite basic stuff. We need mass, we need lots of drones. I'd be talking to Ukrainians quite a lot about this. I mean, the Ukrainians are big innovators now in a lot of the very relevant defence technologies. They've also got a lot of spare capacity. They need resources to go into them. The UK is very well placed to work with the Ukrainians. So it's a new factor in the equation that I would encourage us to follow. But I would stress just how important at the moment it is to fill basic stocks. And so, because we've just seen from Ukraine just how much gets used in single days, and we couldn't fight that sort of war at the moment.
Coming back to you, Professor Laurie, what do you see as the main barriers within the UK defence sector that are going to stop us being able to seize this?
I mean, this industry needs confidence that it gets the orders. Unfortunately, we've got into a culture where industry does not come up with the ideas, it waits. And I think we need a culture where industry comes up with more ideas of its own and looks for support, is more proactive. And we need a much more, everybody says this, we need a much more streamlined process of our own. We need to discourage continual fiddling with requirements, gold plating and all the things that everybody says they know is bad but keep on doing. So that I think is, this is a cultural thing, and you need to get onto, in a sense, I don't like the term, but in a way it's relevant to war footing. I did the official history of the Falklands, and I did the Iraq inquiry, and in both cases you can see that when you're in that sense of emergency, a lot of things happen quite quickly that otherwise would take months or even years. And I think we need to get ourselves into that frame of mind where we accept there's an emergency at the moment, and that the endless pages of information that have to be provided and the committees that have to be gone through, you can start to circumvent that. It's a mindset, but it can be done, and we've seen it being done in past campaigns.
And then, Dr. Alexandra, what could it mean in terms of improving capacity and capabilities in Europe?
Well, I think number one, overcoming European fragmentation. If today Europe doesn't have even the beginning of a defense industrial base, it's because of its fragmentation. Europe produces more types of tanks than the entire rest of the world. So it's just not working. I think it's not a question of money again. It's a question of strategy, and it's a question of how Europeans do it together. And this is where I see the EU institutions and the European Commission as, I would call it as a sort of facilitating platform, or a platform to incentivize EU member states to collectively invest in innovation and in joint industrial projects. Number two, there is a speed issue, as we all know, right? It's 2030, 2040, 2050, and what we need is now, in the 3 to 5 years to come. So how do Europeans speed up their production processes, the speed to which they produce military equipment? And there I agree with Lawrence Freedman that, there are very basic things that Europeans should be doing together, but at a faster speed. The third thing is deeply political. If we have fragmentation among our industries, it's because the politics of the industrial dynamics is dominating and undermining cooperation strategies, right? It's all about politics at the end of the day. And so again, it relies on political leaders of these countries that have strong defense industries to sell to their constituencies, to their citizens, the importance of pooling and sharing capabilities, money, funding, investments with other countries in order to make a stronger European defense industrial base. So fragmentation, it's the EU institutions as a role of incentivize and facilitating. And then at the end of the day, it's all about politics.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Michelle Scroggin, please.
Thank you, Chair. We've talked about what's happening in the here and now, but I'd like to look at some of the longer term implications and specifically ask what your predictions are on the long term implications of the new US administrations and their approach to the relations between US and UK and US and Europe in particular.
This is one of the least predictable administrations I've known. So we struggle from day to day. So a couple of things. First, I assume the long term is they do less in Europe and more in Indo-Pacific. That's been the policy since President Obama. But they keep on getting themselves drawn back to Europe and the Middle East because of one crisis or another. We've got an issue with Iran coming up. The point about that signal chat was that they were talking about taking on the Houthis, and did take on the Houthis, not as continuation of Biden's policy. So although they talk in these terms, you can't assume that crises don't keep on pulling them back. And that's possibly still, the European situation is still tense because of what's going on in Ukraine. If Ukraine is sorted, which again I've made clear I'm not confident about in the near term, then I think you will see an acceleration of the American move away. I still find it hard to imagine they would move away completely. You've also got other issues. The financial one is going to get quite serious, I think. There's big issues with American debt. At the moment, American debt is more than the Pentagon's budget, and it's not going down. And indeed, it may be going up quite sharply at the moment. So we could be one thing just to keep in mind is we could face a major financial crisis this year or next, and that will have enormous implications for all of these debates. I mean, we still talk about the knock-on effects of the 2008-9 financial crisis. We could have another one. It's not a prediction, but these are possibilities that will affect how these things develop. And lastly, a lot depends on what goes on with China. I mean, China seems to be the main beneficiary of almost everything that's going on at the moment. I mean, they're making their own mistakes, but the Chinese are just all watching what's going on, and they're seeing the US, the Western alliance, in trouble. I mean, it's not in a good place. And we're trying to we're trying to work out our policies. Europe doesn't have a united view on Europe, on China, I mean, and the US is debating amongst itself about whether China is a useful partner or a really big adversary. And I think that debate is going to be quite important for how the other debates develop. So I can't predict, but you can see the issues that are going to be coming up, and some of these are coming up quite fast. I mean, I think the Iranian issue is one that has to be sorted, I think, by the summer, in terms of all restraints on the Iranians on their nuclear program soon be off.
Thank you. And Dr. Alexandra, do you have any particular thoughts on the relationship between the US and the UK versus the US and Europe?
No, absolutely. I think one thing we need to keep in mind is that, you're looking at the future. We need to look at these deeper trends that are reshaping US domestic politics and US shifting foreign policy priorities, and they're actually completely intertwined. And because foreign policy is domestic politics and vice versa, it's going to be very difficult for any ally to influence the trajectory of these policies. One of the most striking trends we need to keep in mind is the growing intersection between national security and trade, right, which is merged into the notion of economic security. It's all about economic security, and that spans the three priorities of the Trump administration, but even post-Trump administration. Number one, China. Number two, immigration. And then number three is about trade. So that's number one. Let's look at the deep trends. And so the UK and European partners need to prepare now for what comes after these forthcoming 4 years. Number two, when it comes to the future of the transatlantic relationship, I think the strength of the transatlantic link will depend much less on Washington than on the UK and Europe. The initiatives will have to come from the other side of the Atlantic because they will not come from the United States. And so, again, it's about boosting European credibility, European capabilities to remain as part of the conversation and to remain a credible ally in order to respond to current and future challenges. Number three, I think we need to be very pragmatic in a British kind of way, if I can say. I think the future of the transatlantic relationship has already become, but will become even more compartmentalized. We will have opportunities to cooperate with the United States where our interests are aligned, but there will also be an increasing amount of issues where we will not be aligned, and therefore Europeans and the UK will need to continue to work on, let's say, the climate agenda, potentially on Ukraine, on the future of European security, with less of the United States, and sometimes without the United States if the United States decides to take a different trajectory. Very last thing, because we're looking, forward, I would say this is a time for the UK and Europe to be creative, right? Because we have this uncertainty within Europe, within the United States, and all around us in the world. It's a time to be innovative. We cannot go back to old formulas or old diplomatic solutions. And by that, I mean, and I'm seeing that live and experiencing that live these past couple of weeks, is also to think of diversifying partnerships, alliances with other countries and partners. What I'm seeing concretely is Indo-Pacific allies, South Korea, Japan, Australia, reaching out actively to European allies and say, we want to deepen our strategic relationship with you. We have the same trends with Southeast Asian countries. So let's be creative and let's rethink also our own alliance system at the time where these alliances are shifting as well. So it's not just doom and gloom. It's also about identifying some of the opportunities that are out there through these global and domestic shifts, and how do you transform these shifts into an opportunity. And I do see an opportunity for the UK and the EU to really strengthen their cooperation. And I would say it's not a luxury, it's not an option. It's truly a necessity. There's just no choice than to grow closer together.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you very much. Let's bring in Alex Baker, please.
Thank you, Chair. So, based on everything you've both said, one of the fundamental things that we need to sort out if we are going to make progress is how we finance our defence capabilities and how Europe does this. And obviously there's been a lot of talk about this in recent months, and myself and my colleague Luke Charters MP are leading a campaign looking at how these works in the UK. But one of the ideas on the table is the concept of a multilateral bank, the Defence, Security and Resilience Bank. Do you think that such an institution could solve some of the concerns around European defence capability?
In principle, I mean, I'm not going to claim I know enough about it or have looked hard enough to give you a very detailed answer. As far as I'm concerned, the main need is speed, less red tape, and clarity about what you're trying to do. However you're financing things, if there's a muddle about what your strategic concepts are or your operational plans are, then they're still not going to be solved. So I think a source of finance that's easily accessible obviously still has to have the normal safeguards, but is easily accessible would be a good thing. But beyond that, I don't claim to have a great deal to add.
Dr. Alexandra?
Yes, no, I think, what you've seen with the, the EIB you're referring to and other initiatives that have been taken place at the EU level shows the shift that I was talking about in the European cultural mindset. I think this is a good move. We should be using at the EU level all the tools that the EU already has. And again, that's an invitation of how to not create new mechanisms, new tools, or new acronyms, but using the institutions, the structures that the EU already has, but use it in a much more strategic, and if I could say, in a more geopolitical way. So I think that decision on the EIB was exactly aligned with that approach. In addition, to the rearm Europe and all of this. So I think this is the right direction, but there is a need to accelerate. And again, there is a need to use these EU tools and frameworks and mechanisms to incentivize European countries to collectively fund joint industrial projects. Because if it's not the case, then the money will just go elsewhere. I'm also struck, I was talking about the shifting alliances. to see how others countries are stepping into the European defense portfolio. I'm thinking of South Korea, right, who just signed with Poland a $13 billion plus armament equipment agreement. This is also telling you that because we are not able at the European level to actually get our act together now, that other countries will, propose themselves as alternative to maybe some of the U.S. industrial products that Europeans has been importing. So it's interesting to see the dynamics. But what I would like to see is Europeans get together with the UK, and again, I would say, basically identify 3 big industrial projects where Europeans know and have identified critical capability gaps, and get together, invest together, and speed up the timeline so that it is not delivered in 30, 40, or 50 years from now. And I'm absolutely convinced that it is doable. It's just a question of politics at the end of the day.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Dr. Scheffer, I know you had to leave at this point. Thank you very much for giving evidence today. And my very best wishes to yourself.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Professor Freedman, we will continue if we can. Fred Thomas, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of quick fire questions, if I may. We've had a really fruitful discussion. We've not talked much about Brexit, the fact that the United Kingdom left the European Union, having voted to do so in 2016, and we left a couple of years after. Do you think, in the round, that leaving the European Union made this country less secure?
Well, I voted against it, so I have to say I don't think it was a good idea. A lot of that was some issues with internal security as well, on the police side as well as international. I don't think the defence side was a big Brexit issue, other than ideas about European armies being imposed on us if we stayed, which was never going to happen. So I don't think it made vast amounts of difference to the defence and security side.
No, and I think looking back, we could probably all agree it wasn't much discussed during those Brexit discussions, whichever side of it you were on.
Yeah.
The security implications of leaving the Union. And that leads me on to my next quick-fire question, which is about intelligence sharing. So we've spoken a lot about spending money together with other European countries, or trying to. We've spoken about the nuclear shield, so to speak. In terms of the intelligence sharing, you alluded to it earlier, as did my colleague Calvin Bailey, around some of those quite old now, sort of 70-year-old agreements with America that have led to our very close intelligence sharing arrangements with America that then led on to Five Eyes, and the position we're in now where, in terms of intelligence, we're much, much closer to the US and to Five Eyes than we really can be to Europe. So what is the scope here to change that? And obviously we wouldn't want, in an ideal world, we wouldn't want to rescind anything we've got with America or Five Eyes, noting some of the Signal messaging app incidents, but we maybe would want a much closer, and maybe need now and require a much closer intelligence sharing relationship with European partners. Who can we trust? This would be quite a new thing for us, to be a very big departure from recent policy.
So you use the word trust, which is absolutely central to intelligence sharing. And where trust is lost, intelligence sharing becomes more difficult, including with America. Now we can see both ways. And we've got big issues with Five Eyes, potentially, at the moment. New Zealand sort of became more marginal some time ago. The Americans threatened Canada with sort of taking them out of Five Eyes. how serious this was, I tend to doubt, but the point was made. You've got a head of intelligence in the US who regularly retweets odd conspiracy theories. It's not a comfortable situation, and we're sort of relying on the intensity of the cooperation that you see, for example, in the National Security Agency and GCHQ, just continuing, because it's almost impossible to imagine how you would disentangle it. And between CIA and MI6 and so on, and their equivalents in Canada and Australia. And I think at the working level, all the impetus is to continue with that. But it's hard to separate yourselves completely from what's going on at the political level. So I think this is going to be challenging. And if we see major breaches of intelligence, this will become more problematic.
Professor, let me bring you on to the European
side. On the European side,
who can we trust? Who can we share intelligence?
Well, I mean, I can't give you a scorecard about who to trust. I mean, the major players, we've had a lot to do with the Germans in the past, and it's been a variable relationship. But and the French too. I mean, the major players in most things are going to be major players in intelligence as well. What you don't have is the institutionalized structure you have with Five Eyes. I mean, Five Eyes meet regularly as a group. They know each other. You don't have that sort of linkage. And some of the ones that the institutions that we did have, we did lose because of Brexit. So there's a certain amount of work you could imagine to recreate a lot of that. But the fact is that for a lot of the security challenges that we face, you've got to look at people who've got spy satellites and listening centres, not a lot of European countries.
And so last quickfire question. We've all been very proud to see the British Prime Minister managing to walk a tightrope between our closest allies, the US and Europe. And he's managing to do that with remarkable aplomb. And we saw some of those very intense White House visits where we felt our Prime Minister came out of that very well, managed to maintain our good relationship with America and his own personal relationship with President Trump. But recently, over the weekend, we've seen another European leader, President Alexandra Stubb of Finland, golfing at Mar-a-Lago. And this committee, well, I don't speak for the committee, but I was on a committee visit to Finland, and we had a private meeting with President Stubb, and he was very charming. He was very frank with us about some of the challenges Europe faced. He's told us as well at the time that his wife is American, and he's got a relationship with America. So it was no great surprise to see him managing to take that message to President Trump. And then the very next day, President Trump in the press came out and said he would be very angry with Putin if Putin didn't adhere to ceasefire and kind of keep going with those negotiations, which seems, from the outside, like a very positive output from that meeting. So what's your reflection on that? Do you think that's now how these kind of world events are going to be shaped, golfing trips and one-on-one meetings?
Well, yes, well, the late Prime Minister Abe in Japan decided golfing was the way to get through to President Trump. I'm not sure if Prime Minister Starmer is a golfer.
He's a footballer.
But yes, I wouldn't.
His wife's English, by the way, not American.
Yeah. So Stubb is quite angry. I think I would say generally I think people have underestimated the importance of Finland joining the alliance, and Sweden too, but particularly Finland, because you bring depth, a history of resilience, and they have fought Russia. I think it was a positive impact. I mean, hopefully Trump was moving in that direction anyway, because it should be apparent to him as it is to the rest of us that Putin was dragging his feet. But it's an indicator that, you know, we're in a period where personal relationships, difficult choices, whims of the moment can have long-term consequences.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Freedman, just in the last few minutes that we've got, let me just ask you just a few questions, if I may. Firstly, there's been a suggestion that the US may give up its role of SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander for Europe. And I mention that because just last month, NBC reported that the Trump administration was considering that, and I know that there has been pushback from the chairman, the Republican chairman of the House and the Senate Armed Services Committee. But in your opinion, how credible is that suggestion that the US may give up the role of SACEUR or try to combine SACEUR with the role of Africa Command as well?
Yeah. So there's a number of things going on here. One is probably a sensible look at the various regional commands and do they make sense? Can they be rationalised in some way? That is going on. Secondly, this question of whether there is a push within the Pentagon just to hand over stuff to Europeans. And of course you had at the last Ramstein meeting, which is about donating to Ukraine, the American Secretary of Defense handed over to John Healey chairmanship. So do we imagine that happening on a bigger scale? I think it would be a tremendous shift for the Americans to hand over the commands. Now, if you're, at some point, if you're cutting your forces below a certain point, then it'd be very hard to explain why you're holding on to the commands. So these things are bound up together. But I think you'll see tremendous pushback in the Senate and certainly in the Army. Armies don't like giving up command posts. Ours, the UK doesn't, because it's part of the way you manage the careers of your best people, and you don't want to be excluded. And I think so long as the Americans are involved in European security, they will want what influence they have over it. If this did happen, it would be an enormous shift. And how the integrated command would be handled in those circumstances would require massive adjustments. So I don't preclude it at some point in the future. I think we've got some way to go before we're there.
That's it. So you don't think it's imminent, and although as you
hope it's not imminent.
Yeah, as you rightly know, armies may not want to give up their post, but it ultimately will come down to the US president.
I think it's a question of your overall force posture in Europe. Yeah. The level of American commitment at the moment makes it absolutely right that they have the senior command posts. That could change.
Good. Well, look, also, when I studied at the Royal College of Defence Studies, we explored great power competition. Now, at present, there are only the US and China who would be considered by experts as great powers, because in order to be a great power, one needs a great military and one also needs great economy. Do you think that what is going on at the moment, while it might be short-term pain for European nations, that if there is increased American absence or presence within Europe, with that reduced American presence, if the European nations were to ramp up, do you think that within a few years that they could potentially be the third great power?
I don't think Europeans have got the unity to think in those terms yet. Also, we have a very clear model of what a great power is and the role that they play, from going back to the UK's role in the 19th century and into the start of this 20th century, and then the role of the United States. no particular evidence that China sees itself in that sort of way. It has a different idea of what it is to be a major power, which is largely looking after its own interest in its own region, and then being quite mercantilist elsewhere. There used to be talk of the EU as a civil power, what we now call sort of soft power, that they wouldn't be so militaristic and so on. I think Europe, and it's not, it isn't just the EU. It is important to keep in mind that when Keir Starmer was hosting on that important weekend a load of leaders, there were five countries there that were not EU: Canada, UK, Ukraine, obviously, Turkey, and Norway. So it's not just an EU question, and all of those countries make different sorts of contributions. So I think, and of course, in Britain, France, Germany, Spain, these were the great powers of the past. So I think we have much more complex political configurations now.
Agreed.
And that's probably European countries in this have to do more in their own continent. Whether they'll be great powers in terms of playing roles far away from the European continent is a different question.
In essence, basically, divisions amongst European nations will prohibit them from attaining that great power status, as can be seen, I guess, at the moment, in that some of them are not even meeting the 2% NATO defence target. And lastly, if I may, in terms of the UK-EU Security Pact, it's widely considered that that may well be signed very soon. Now, in the event that that is not signed, because of the strong arming that's going on with regards to whether it's fishing, whether it's a whole host of other things that are being brought in, as has been reported by the French government and others, what do you think would happen that if that UK-EU Security Pact is not signed? Would you envisage the UK's contribution to European security, whether in the short term or the medium term, would that begin to wane as political schisms would appear, or do you think that it would still carry on unabated?
Well, Europe's our continent and European security is our interest, so I don't think that will change. I think it will be very disappointing if we can't move forward with the pact, and it'll be, when you put the fisheries issue against what's at stake in the security side, it would be tragic, in my view, if one was allowed to influence the other. I would concentrate on just keeping this as a separate issue, and then I'm all in favour of looking at all these other questions, but they're of a different scale. So the UK's role in Europe, European security, is not going to change, I don't think, substantially. We work a lot with the Northern Tier, and not all of those are members of the EU. So, but it would be much better if we can use this to reinforce our relationships with so many of the key players in Europe that are members of the EU.
Certainly, Professor. I would definitely agree with yourself on that point, that at a time of such crisis for our continent's defence and security, that solidarity should be the order of the day rather than political posturing and short-term gains on fisheries and so on. But with that, I think the time has defeated us. Professor Freedman, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you here and your expert knowledge. I am sure that has significantly enhanced our inquiry into UK's contribution to European security. Thank you, and with that I bring today's hearing to a close. Order.